How do you determine if your students, at least, are speaking enough English to qualify?
There is a test that is given for them if they have not completed high school or have a GED. There is an English test, or where English is a component of that test, the ability to benefit test. So by virtue of passing that, they've met the requirement.
Well, I've seen many times on carrier profiles, driver couldn't speak English properly, but was never put on a service, But now with the new executive order, it is now being put back into place with the out of service.
Like you said, it's basically refocus or bringing up to the surface what has already been on the books, but now it's just a matter of enforcement. So it's nothing brand new. It is just a revitalized effort to enforce the language that was already on the books.
How to manage the safety department like an expert without the 30-year learning curve. If you want to lead the safety department like a veteran and you don't want to spend years in the hot seat learning it the hard way or decades of trial and error, text the word success to 365-364-0714. Text me now the word success 365-364-0714. We are talking this week on the Trucking Risk and Insurance Podcast about English proficiency. We have Jeff Burkhart from Ancora on the show, and that's our topic, English proficiency. Let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Trucking Risk and Insurance Podcast.
Hey, Jeff. Welcome back to the podcast. Can you take a minute for those viewers who didn't see you or meet you on the first time you were on the show? Take a minute and introduce yourself and Ancora.
I certainly will. Fantastic to be back. It's certainly my pleasure. My name is Jeff Burkhart. I'm the Senior Director of Operations for the Commercial Driver Training Program for Ancora Education. Ancora is a post-secondary institution of higher education. We're based in Arlington, Texas. We run multiple schools of our own, colleges, 19 of them, 17 of which have CDL training as far as one program offering within their catalogs. But a more significant portion of the CDL training business is with our Ancora training division, in which we contract with those entities that need somebody to do the training for them. For example, community colleges. They have CDL training in their portfolio or their catalog of course offerings. We have about 42 of those combined with our 17 of our own schools. And then we have a whole slew of direct business relationships to where we have private entities or government for that matter that outsource that CDL training. So all in sum, we're probably in the neighborhood of 80 to 90, because there's some fluidity there, 80 to 90 locations from coast to coast, literally in the U.S. to where we're doing CDL entry-level driver training.
And this is why we've asked you on the show, because the hot topic at the moment is English proficiency, or one of many hot topics, I guess, but certainly the one that is hitting trucking a lot. And speaking to two Canadians, we have a lot of immigrants within the truck driving community. And I read this morning that as of this day, what is this? This is July the 2nd. So happy July 4th coming up for you. We just finished our Canada Day. But I read this morning in CDL Life that so far, 40 Mexican truck drivers have been put out of service in the first week of enforcement.
Wow.
As a school or as a director of the school, I know you're involved. How do you determine if your students, at least, are speaking enough English to qualify?
Yeah, great question. And I had seen similar stats that you just referred to. I know Freight Waves, the publication, was saying that their estimation that there could be perhaps 10% of the current U.S. truck driver workforce may not meet this standard.
Yeah.
So, depending on who you ask or what resource you're going to, you might get different levels. But, regardless of the levels of estimations, it is going to have an impact to some degree. Yeah. As far as the schools go, it depends. And I hate to use that term, but, for our own schools, we already have an English proficiency requirement almost embedded. Because we're accredited, our schools, we have to meet certain requirements for proof of education. In other words, they have to have a high school diploma or a GED, using, U.S. terms. In other words, they've completed high school. For our B2B relationships, that's where we're contracted service providers. That vetting, if you will, has already been accomplished by the employer partner because it's their employee base that we are training. But specific to your question, we do have an open enrollment environment where anybody from the public can come into our schools and would like to enroll in CDL training. So to answer your question, there is a test that is given for them if they have not completed high school or have a GED. There's an English test, or where English is a component of that test, the ability to benefit test. So by virtue of passing that, they've met the requirement. But I want to take just a little bit of a step back before that. Then everybody knows that truck drivers are in high demand. It's a highly attractive occupation because of that, and the wages and the relative minimal amount of upskilling or certification you need. In other words, getting that CDL. So we vet them on the front end just by a foundational interview. Because what is very important is for us and other legitimate and respected folks in the training sector is we're not going to take your money, just take your money. If somebody comes to our school and they are unable to speak English proficiently enough or any other standard that they may not meet, it's not a matter of, hey, this is a quick grab for tuition for them ultimately to be unsuccessful and fail. So we and other school partners that I work with, we do some vetting on the front end. It's not necessarily conversational English either. Now, the proficiency, as far as the standard goes in the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulation itself, as far as general qualifications for drivers, it's kind of ambiguous. It says sufficiency, which could be in the eye of the beholder. In other words, it's somewhat subjective. But things that we do is we have that conversation. And if we feel, and some of our employer partners, they do have an extremely diverse workforce to where ESL, there is English as a second language component to a large, to a segment of their population, of their employee population. So we work collaboratively with them. We want to afford the greatest opportunity, which this job certainly presents, but we have to be responsible in that we're not going to enroll. We're not going to engage in business practices just for the financial aspect of it. They need to be able to speak in English sufficiently enough in order for them to take the training. Sometimes it does not present itself until the training starts. A majority of it is done on the very front end because we want to get started off on the right foot.
Right. Well, this regulation's been on the books for a very, very, very long time. So it's nothing new. The unfortunate aspect is the enforcement. I probably not even the right word. The enforcement of this regulation has always been there. It's the out of service criteria that's been missing for about the last 10 to 12 years. So I've seen many times on carrier profiles, driver couldn't speak English properly, but was never put out of service, but now with the new executive order, it is now being put back into place with the out of service. So it's unfortunate that we're seeing this big scare because the law has not changed.
That's a valid point. And for those in the know who have been in the sector, they make the exact same comments. So not to go down the history lesson path here, but about 9 years ago, whenever then President, Obama's during his final term, in 2016, the agency being the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, drivers whose English skills were found lacking were to receive a citation, but not prohibited from working. Before that, the penalty was getting placed on out of service status. And it started with President Trump's executive order not too long ago that, like you said, it's basically a refocus or bringing up to the surface what has already been on the books, but now it's just a matter of enforcement. So it's nothing brand new. It is just a revitalized effort to enforce the language that was already on the books.
Right.
And
right. Well,
just hang on, judges, before you go on. It is Regulation 391.11 under Section B2, and I'll read it if I can do it without stuttering. And as you said, John, this is really old legislation. can read and speak the English language sufficiently to converse with the general public, to understand highway traffic signs and signals in the English language, to respond to official inquiries, and to make entries on reports and records. So that's the section we're really talking about here, quite specifically. Jeff, sorry, John, I cut you off. Now I'll throw it back.
No. I was going to say it probably one of the downfalls from the Canadian perspective is we don't have that type of legislation here. Now, you have that legislation in place as an immigrant coming into Canada as part of I believe the permanent residency and citizenship. There's that aspect of being able to speak English, but from a commercial driver's
failed, John.
Right. Yeah. But unfortunately, from the commercial driver aspect, we'll actually give you an interpreter to pass that driver's license. And it's like, is that really right? And so you have a lot of new Canadians who even started up in trucking because, well, limitations are very lax and easy to get into. And now all of a sudden they start traveling to the U.S. thinking, well, it's no different than the U.S. because a lot of them don't read the rules of what goes on in the U.S. So now all of a sudden, I'm thinking, that the big talk is, the southern states, and having this Mexican issue. And I'm going, there's a lot of Canadians that have this issue as well. So I'm quite curious to see how this is going to play out.
Yeah, I agree. And what's interesting about that is, or within that realm there, is that for inspections for drivers in the commercial zones along the U.S.-Mexican border, that's where it is enforced in full. Now, that was specifically noted that corridor. Versus, I have not seen any language per se as far as the U.S. Canadian border, but there is that specifically talking about the U.S. Mexico border.
Yeah.
Well, I would bet that there's many Canadian truck drivers who will not pass that inspection, and I will also bet that there's many American truck drivers who may not pass as well, especially those that are fluent in Spanish. And I'm not talking about down in Mexico. Chicago has a huge Spanish component to it. There's many other areas in the U.S. that the main language is Spanish. So I don't think this is a Canadian issue, a Mexican issue. It is an issue, and I agree with safety being at the forefront. Jeff, do you have any help for carriers specifically in assessing their driver pool and new hires specifically in, what is proficient in the English language? Is there a test that you can guide people to?
There are multiple tests that are out there. As far as the FMCSA questionnaire, the interview, and I have a copy of it. There are literally 30 signs.
Do you have the redacted copy or the real copy?
No, real copy that's been distributed to FMCSA officials. I mean, there's about 14 different questions. There are 37 roadsides on there. Now, that's not to say that this is like, top secret type things. So I think as far as carriers go, employers, just in general, they should do their due diligence. Do not turn a blind eye. If you are interviewing a prospective driver that you desperately need to fill a seat, you are taking on a huge responsibility on many different levels, much less the person's ability to speak or converse in English. Right. If there's any question at all, well, number one, okay, they have their CDL. That's what you're first going to verify, right? But like in the conversation I had with another entity that had reached out, similar to what you did here in terms of, discussing this topic. And I remarked to them that it is very possible that an individual has gone their whole life without having to provide, the English proficiency proof. In other words, they may have gone to school that was taught in the native tongue. They may have passed a CDL skills test that was administered in the native tongue now this would take a bad actor. It was a third party testing, it wouldn't be at a state level. and they got their CDL and they're just cruising right along and they're just doing their thing, unless they're pulled over for an inspection or they're at a weigh station or something to where there's going to be an engagement with a regulatory official or body. That person's lack of English in this example is never going to surface. Right. It will surface, though, on the employer side. The employer is going to be the constant here. So I think the first responsibility is on them in terms of making sure their drivers are fully compliant, not just with having medical examiners certifications that are up to date and valid CDLs, but being able to make sure they meet all the requirements that are inherent within those. And English as the language to be spoken is part of that.
And the other part, I may be able to, if I'm not under duress or not under stress, I may be able to converse with you fairly well if I'm an immigrant. But you have an officer in a uniform, an officer who's in a uniform, perhaps carrying a gun, and I'm from another country and I have different belief systems. That officer coming up to me, I mean, quite honestly, when I was a truck driver and I got pulled into the scale, I got nervous. And I'm a born here or a North American. I got pulled into American scales and I got nervous. And I was born here, and English is fluent, as you can tell, not very grammatically correct maybe, but fluent. And I would get nervous. I can only imagine if I wasn't born here, how my nerves might even bubble up even more and become more tongue-tied. Because as you alluded to, there are certain questions the officers are supposed to ask us, right? Go ahead, Jeff.
I think that you hit one of the concerns just head on. Regardless of your proficiency or your comfort, it is by nature an intimidating environment, even under the most benign of circumstances. But especially if you're not real confident in English, you have your CDL, and by all accounts, you got it in the proper way. But you're having a conversation with, like you said, an officer, authoritative figure. And along with that, the other concerns that I'm hearing just from, the drivers in general, that would be part of this realm is they're worried about inspectors making subjective, non-standardized determinations, whether it be inherent biases that an individual has, because we're talking about human beings here, yep. Right? Whether it be that, discrimination is what I'm getting at against those with some strong accents or regional dialects. The proverbial melting pot that America is, and you already alluded to this, and Canada is very diverse as well, certain areas more so than others, but we have to account for all these things. But, it's not math. If there were some sort of a math quantifier here, well, this is a universal math. But right. This is like asking some questions in English and expecting a certain, cadence of response. Could be influenced by accents, could be influenced by the ears of a biased individual. And even we see cultural differences, even with male and female. Some cultures do not take particularly well with authoritative figures of the opposite gender, as an example. Right. However, all those things we have to, we can't. It's not a matter of boiling the ocean. You have to be able to start somewhere, and be able to have the faith that things in this nature are being very legitimately executed in all degrees of fairness. That's good. That could be a big ask, though. And strip all that away, strip all that away, and under the best of circumstances, friendly circumstances, so to speak, you're going to be nervous. So you make an extremely valid point there.
Well, and the other part of it is there's no law that says the officer has to be a born American. So that officer also could be an immigrant and also may have an accent, and now they're conversing. It could be really terrible. One of the things I did want to ask you, since you mentioned that you have the sheet for the officers, the training document, and I know that at least the ones that I have available are redacted, and for good reason. they don't want every question out there so that the employers could possibly train their drivers on how to answer the specific question. So, and I don't deny the government that. I think that's a good strategy. I was on and I don't know if you attended the CVSA conference earlier last week, actually, where CVSA was speaking about this. And she was quite good in that she said the questions are all trucking related and specific to truck inspections. The typical question that is supposed to be asked during a truck inspection. Would you, one, agree with that statement? And if you do, would you elaborate on how it's to be conducted?
Yes, I agree with the statement. You're exactly right. They're not arbitrary questions. They're not abstract in any way. You're not asking questions that aren't relevant to the situation and to the role of the individual being interviewed, which is a driver. Some of those questions include, when did you start your trip today? Where are you driving to today? Who are you driving for today? What are you hauling? Those are very typical questions there. And as far as road signs, they're no different than what is placed in front of the individual years ago whenever they got their learner's permit.
Correct.
So it's not like a bait and switch in any way. From what I've seen, and obviously I'm not an FMCSA or CVSA official, but they appear to be pretty benign in nature. In other words, it's not setting an expectation that is entirely different or even moderately different than what they should have gone through had they, pursued this in the correct path to begin with.
And the one example that she used specifically was, what are you hauling today? And she used the example of, if the driver answers, gosh, I really don't know. I just went to the yard and hooked up. I was told to hook up to this trailer. I hooked up and off I went. I really don't know what's on. She said that would be considered acceptable, even though you didn't answer the question, but you displayed that you understood the question as opposed to, was the answer right or wrong? Damn it, you should know what's on your truck. But
that's actually an extremely valuable comment for context. It's not looking for the correct answer. It's being able to articulate sufficiently in English some type of answer. Again, that's a really great point, because a driver might get half a dozen questions. They may not know the specific answer to any of them, but just like what you just said there. Well, I'm not quite sure. I left Chicago at about 3 a.m, or obviously I don't have an accent right now, but even if they're able to articulate in that way, they're meeting that burden of English. So it's not a matter of a quiz or a test. That, as far as there's plenty of things there for hours of service, et cetera, to where people are supposed to know, but you're not really grilling them on, well, you didn't say bill of lading. You said your papers show you that you're hauling, whatever, oil filters. Just because you don't use specific terminology is not a prerequisite. It's just being able to articulate sufficiently. Great point.
Right. It's about the conversation, not about the answers that come out of it.
It is about the conversation, and just one more point about that. And this is kind of, what we spoke about earlier is, our schools and high quality other, partners in the space, we conduct the training in English. We have plenty of ESL situations. We have bilingual, or multilingual instructors as well as students. We have 3 schools down on the border in Texas in the Rio Grande Valley, and we have schools up in Eastern Maine and in upstate New York. We do them a disservice if we teach them in their native tongue just to make the training easier, because the skills test is in English.
Yeah.
And so sometimes that lack of proficiency presents itself early on, and then we have various support mechanisms to assist with that, and courses and things of that nature to help them become proficient enough. Because the conversation you have at the counter or at the checkout line with an employee, with a clerk, that's entirely different than going over the mechanical systems and the terminology used in the vehicle inspection. We have challenges with that with English speakers because it's so outside of that vernacular, talking about components and systems, et cetera. That's a challenge there. So one can only imagine how much more of a challenge it is for the non-English native learner.
Well, you're making me laugh because all of a sudden I'm thinking air brakes, air brakes. And if I was not a truck driver, all the new terminology that I've got to learn when it comes to just air brakes, and that's only one small component of being a driver, understanding your braking system. And then if I was if English wasn't my first language, I can only imagine the extra hurdles that is putting in front. But I think, congrats to you and Ancora for putting first, being aware of and having the high standard. You've got to be proficient in order to come to our school. I'm sure one of the things that you monitor closely are your graduation rates and your success rates in your graduates getting a job. Is that not something that you monitor and measure all the time?
100% accurate. Or whether it be our internal 17 locations that are accredited. So there are benchmarks for course completion, for licensure, and for placement, getting the job. And that's because of Department of Education requirements and whatnot. And we have no problem with that. The standalone CDL schools and my partners and friends in this space, they have similar, whether they need to report to a regulatory body or not, they do similar because it's a good business practice. You want to be able to validate that your training, your product is paying off by the returning on that investment. So you're absolutely right. We do monitor those things. They're those key performance indicators, those metrics, those benchmarks. It's all within the same realm. But yes, we certainly do. And it does us no good service to try to circumvent those, look for the money grab, go ahead and enroll somebody who won't be able to complete or get a job. But, hey, checks in, the cash is in the bank. This has been made.
Yeah.
That is for bad actors in this space. And thankfully, they're on the vast minority of players.
Yep. Yeah. Well, we all have family that travel the roadways, and the last thing we want to do is put somebody that's not competent to operate a commercial motor vehicle out on the road while our families are out there.
That's extremely valuable. As far as, and this is kind of reverting back a little bit to where, what was the catalyst for this? If this was already on the books for so long, why has it come to the forefront now or been resurfaced?
Right.
You're going to get probably, 100 different opinions from 100 different people. But from what we have seen up to today, since whenever these things were, the executive order came out and the follow-ups here in the past month and a half or so, it's not a stretch to think there might be some political motivation to it. Now, whether that is, again, I'm not speaking for anybody in particular. I'm just just in general, trying to encapsulate the different voices you hear. Some people say, well, no, that has nothing to do with anything. Other voices are going to say, well, there is a, big mandate or a big agenda as far as, the controlling whether it be the border or just immigration in general, which is such a dynamic. I'm not going to pretend to start to broach the entire subject. But again, some people are it may not be a stretch to think that this is kind of related to that. Otherwise, why would it come up now versus it being pretty much dormant for the last, whatever number of years?
Yep.
Well,
the bottom line, though, if it contributes to safety, well, then two things up to Mike Burkhart's comments. Number one, it should have always been enforced.
Yep.
And number two, don't attach any ulterior motives to the fact that it's being reintroduced or refocused on now. It was introduced and put in place years ago by the regulatory bodies that govern this space. Well, then if that science and thought process was sound then, that it should always remain. And if it ultimately will result in safer operators and safer roadways and safer, the roads that we share, well, then I don't care what it is. Fill in the blank regulation.
Yeah.
It should be enforced.
Yep. Agreed. We want everybody to come home.
That's it. Bottom line.
The bottom line is this is the rule and it's being enforced today, and rules change. As long as we live, things are going to change. And this is one of the recent changes, not the rule, the enforcement of the rule. And so we've got to learn to live with it. We've got to learn to hire accordingly. And in your role, you've got to learn to educate accordingly. That's the bottom line. If we want to keep trucks moving, and earlier you said up to 10% of truck drivers may be impacted possibly by this enforcement. Well, they've got time still to learn how to speak English, to answer those trucking related questions more proficiently. That's what I would encourage. Because
I could have said it better myself, I mean, and again, it's not an end all do all. If a truck driver is placed out of service after doing their due diligence by the officer, meaning number one starts with this an interview or the conversation, and if the officer feels that this a little bit shaky, then they can move to phase 2, which is an actual interview. That's usually how it is. And if they're deemed out of service, they're out of service, but the responsibility is on the trucker and the employer, the company they work for. They're both responsible for ensuring that a language violation is corrected before the driver hits the road again.
Right.
So I try to, I'm an optimist by nature. I look at this, silver lining. If there's a discovery point, I'm not going to equate it to the same as, air brakes being out of adjustment or something to that effect. However, it's within that same realm. If there's an out of service order for whatever the reason it is, let's work together. Let's pull the levers that are already in place to meet the requirements of that particular, regulation. And let's get back to business. Let's get the trucker back on the road so they can start, continue making their living, and let's keep moving the goods. It's going to be a win-win. We just hope and that it's all going to be enforced again, like I said earlier, consistently, equally, fairly, all those words.
Yes.
And I think that's a great place to wrap that up, because John and I hope the same thing, that it's going to be enforced fairly, equally, and to a reasonable standard. Jeff, Ancora Education, and just to recap, you've got both colleges that you're associated with, or I guess Ancora owns, correct?
Both. We have ones that we own, 19 campuses, 17 FCDO programs, but we are contracted service providers for entry-level driver training and other transportation-related subjects for a whole slew of community colleges and universities, for that matter, throughout the United States.
Somewhere around 90 different locations is what you had said.
In total, yes. Wow. And we're looking to expand as drivers continue to be in demand. That bodes well for us as far as our business model goes.
Perfect.
And as usual, your contact info is in the show notes down below. So if you've got questions for Jeff, or if you'd like to get your CDL and you're in the US, perfect. I would.
I know the guy. Give me a call. Somebody that can assist. If you have folks that need to get CDLs, by virtue of being employees in your organization or standalone folks, then do not hesitate. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you all. It's definitely a highlight of my day, or any day, rather, whenever I can talk shop with others versus, the day-to-day grind that I have just, with running our operation. But it's topical, kudos to you for bringing this up, and in your forum here. And there's just so much going on in this space. I love the initial conversation we had, and this one also. So I look forward to the next time we can get together again.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, Jeff. It is an important topic, and I appreciate your input. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeff.
Pleasure's all mine.
Thank you, Jeff, and Ancora, for coming on the show and speaking about the enforcement of English proficiency. If you got value from the show, please click a like and hit that subscribe button. John and I appreciate it so much. See you again next week on the Trucking Risk and Insurance Podcast.